Well, we've heard a lot about unintended consequences, about when people try to do good things, governments try to do good things, and then it backfires. And I think nowhere is this more the case with unions. Unions get together to try to make better conditions for their workers, and then they find the unintended consequences of prices rising too high and industries going overseas, and there being fewer jobs for workers than there would be otherwise. And I'm going to illustrate this with some examples from the United States, and then turn to Israel, where I hope that you're going to provide some input to me. And we had a very interesting talk yesterday from Amir at Kohelet, and there are some of the same themes that are going on in the United States. So the question that I'm going to propose today is, do unions help the labor force? And sometimes they can, but other times they go overboard. In the United States, for example, we have the Maritime Workers Union that focuses on training, giving certification to different individuals so that when they come back from one trip on a ship, they can retrain and then they can qualify for higher positions. This is a very useful function. We also see unions that manage to drive companies overseas, thereby giving up their members' jobs completely. Well, what we see here is that American unions are dying, basically. The rate went from 20% to 11% over the past 30 years. We see that in the private sector, which of course is far larger than the public sector, the rate is about 6.7%. And we see in the public sector, it's around 36%. It's interesting that union membership declined more as a percentage of the workforce under President Obama than under President Bush. We also find that in the states, there are about half the states in the United States, unions are not allowed to opt out of workers. Those are called forced unionization states. Workers are not allowed to opt out of unions. In the other half, called free choice states, they are allowed to opt out. There are more union jobs created in the right to work, the free choice states, than in the forced unionization states. So the question is, why is this happening? Well, unions in the United States are putting themselves out of business. The union workforce is getting older. People don't see value in unions anymore, and union behavior doesn't make sense anymore. So take a look at this picture. Here we have an old Jeep. That old Jeep was made in the United States. And we have a new Jeep. And some of these new Jeeps are being made in the United States, but Chrysler just announced that many of these new Jeeps are going to be made in China. And to see why, we need to look at the latest agreements between the unions, the United Auto Workers, and the company. When there was the financial crisis, the three auto companies, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, were in essence bailed out. They didn't have to restructure their wages. So they are unionized. We have other auto companies in the South, Mercedes, BMW, Nissan, Honda, that are not unionized. And the cost per hour of the non-unionized auto workers is about $45 an hour. For the union ones, it's about $73 an hour. And when the companies were in trouble in 2008, rather than letting them go bankrupt, they were bailed out by the government, which meant they didn't have to restructure their wages. They didn't have to lower wages for their employees. They could keep more or less the same contracts. And what that meant was, with the higher wages, these companies didn't have a chance to be more competitive. So they announced that they were keeping the same wages. Then shortly after, they announced they were moving production to Mexico and to China. And for an example, you can just see this Jeep. It's not just the auto industry. There was a company called Pillowtex. It was a textile company, and it was unionized in 1999, and then it failed in 2003. There was a Volkswagen plant in Pennsylvania that was unionized. It was unionized in the 1980s, and then it failed in 1987. Volkswagen then opened another plant in Chattanooga in Tennessee, and 2 years ago it had a vote on whether they should join the union. And they decided no, they were not going to join the union. So one thing about the United States workforce is that it's aging. Young people don't want to belong to unions. So the primary group that belongs to unions is older people. So union members as a share of unemployed, you can see that 14% of people 55 to 64 belong to unions. About 13.6 of people 45 to 54. 9.7% of people 25 to 34, and only 4% of 16 to 24-year-olds. And the young people who are coming into the workforce, I'm not sure have any of you thought about joining a union? Yeah, you've thought about joining a union.
Yeah, in Israel, you have to, if you work in certain companies, like a bank, for example,
then you have to join.
You don't need to think about it.
yeah.
As
Yeah.
a student, also, don't you have a student union? Most students belong to the union.
That's not a workers' union,
No,
though.
it's not working.
Probably we belong to unions that we don't really know.
By default, you
We
belong
don't
to the
somehow,
union,
but-
and if you have to sign up a paper not to belong
Yeah.
to the student union.
So in the United States, when you sign up to join a union, they take money out of your paycheck. So it's very obvious who has joined the union and who hasn't. And young people say, what's the point of joining a union? And they also want to belong to smaller firms. They want to belong to startups. These don't tend to be unionized. The new firms that are starting up, the Googles, the Facebooks, the startup companies, the small businesses, they don't tend to be unionized. And the aging of the union population is a bad sign for unions in the United States. So here's a cartoon showing that people don't see any value in the unions. They say that giving money to the unions is like flushing that money down the toilet. 2 to 4% of their paychecks go in union dues, and plus there's initiation fees of about $50 a year. These union expenditures are now transparent. Unions have to file with the Labor Department any expenditure over $250. So people can see, this is so that union members can go online and they can see what's happening to their money. And this was put in place when I was at the Labor Department under Labor Secretary Elaine Chao. She thought it was important that members could see what was happening with their dues, because quite a large part of it was going to political contributions. And it's important that union members are aware of that, because the traditional idea is that unions spend their money on representation, on training workers, on helping their members. But once these accounts were put online, it was obvious that a lot of the money went to, first of all, union bosses' salaries, which became public, golf trips, foreign travel to beaches. All this was spelled out. And then it became clear also the amount of political contributions that members didn't have a say about and they didn't necessarily agree with. One of our largest public sector unions that represented government employees bragged that it was the largest donor to the 2008 election campaign. The head of the union said, "We are the big dog in this fight and we're happy about it." But that doesn't say much for the union members who actually have to pay this money. So a lot of union behavior just doesn't make any sense anymore. Here's an example from what's called the Fight for 15. Fight for $15 an hour and a union. So you would think from this poster that unions, and in fact this is the SEIU, want their members to make $15 an hour. How many of you think that this is the conclusion from this picture and the banner?
What is SEIU?
SEIU is the Service Employees International Union, one of the largest unions in the United States. Well, in fact, when unions get the $15 an hour, they fight for the $15 an hour. But then what they do is they put an exemption clause in the law. That means their members do not have to be paid $15 an hour. And here I've listed these cities in the United States that have on their books the exemption from the $15 an hour. San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond in California. There's also Richmond in Virginia. Long Beach, San Jose, Seattle Tacoma Airport, Milwaukee, Chicago. These are just some of the cities that have clauses in their laws to say that if you have what's called a collective bargained agreement, if you're part of a union, you don't have to get the $15 an hour that everybody else in the city has to get. And I quoted, for those of you who are interested in law, the applicable legal language. All or any portion of the applicable requirements of this chapter may be waived in a bona fide collective bargaining agreement. So what that means is that the unions can take this $15 an hour and then they go to large employers and they say, well, if you unionize, if you allow us to unionize your workforce, you won't have to pay this $15 an hour. You can pay your workers $10, $11, $12 an hour. So it's a way of these unions expanding membership because they need more members because the members are aging and new people are not signing up. So it appears from the poster above that they want to represent the man in the street, that they want to make things better. But in reality, what they want is just the stream of union dues, and they get that from additional membership. Another reason that they need the stream of union dues is that the pensions that they negotiated for their members are very much underfunded. Recall that only 6.7% of private sector workers belong to unions in the United States, but they have very large what's called multi-employer pensions. And these multi-employer pensions, such as the Central States Teamsters Fund, are only funded about 40%. In the United States, full funding for a pension is, believe it or not, anything from 80% to 100%. You don't have to call it 100% funded for your pension to be fully funded. Then there's another level, which is in critical condition, 60% to 80% funded, which means that the pension has 60 to 80% of the money it needs to pay current retirees and future retirees. Anything under 60% is very much underfunded in a worse category. And what happens is that unions, when they negotiate, they don't negotiate full funding of these pensions. Because if they come to the union members and they say, I've got you a 2% raise, but your pension is fully funded, the members won't be as pleased as if they come back and they say, I've got you a 10% raise, and they don't mention that the pension is underfunded. Now, it's not that these unions don't know anything about funding pensions. They do, because if you look at their pensions, which are all, of course, all this is public information, their pensions are 100% funded, or even 101 or 102% funded. Then there's another class of pensions for people who work for them. For their staffs, those are about 90% funded. But then when it gets to the union members who they're supposed to be representing, it's around 30 or 40 for these large multi-employer pensions. The only way to fix this is by having more members sign up. Now, there's a question over here.
Yeah. Can you explain what does it mean to be like underfunded? Like who funds
Yes.
the rest? How does it?
What is 100%? What is 60%?
Who's
So 100% is if you have a fund that is supposed to be a pension fund. 100% means you have all the money in the fund and it's going to generate a return. Funds generate returns. That means it has enough money to pay for the pensions of current workers, current retirees, current people who are retired, and also people in the future. So really you need, depending on your actuarial assumptions, depending on the rate of growth of the fund, you make assumptions about how much is going in, how much is going out, and there are people called actuaries who can compute whether the amount of money you have represents full funding or less than full funding. So anything between 80% to 100% is known as full funding. Why can something be full funded at 80%? Because it's possible that the stock market returns on this fund are going to be so great that it will catch up to 100%. Anything under 80% is not fully funded. And pensions are extremely important to unions because that's the way they advertise for membership. You look on their websites, they say, join us and we will give you a good pension.
It
Yeah.
means they get 60% funded. It means they get less in the end. If something happens, they get less, so the government sponsors.
So with some pensions, with some private sector pensions, they are insured by the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, which is a government agency that insures pensions. So even if the pension is only 60% funded, then the workers would get the full pension because it would be paid for by the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. But with these multi-employer pensions, for various reasons, they are not fully insured. The unions and the employers didn't want them fully insured. They said, we don't want to abide by these rules. We can take care of it by ourselves. The problem is they haven't been able to take care of it by themselves. And the way they're structured, they're multi-employers, several employers, that if one company drops out, then it means the others are responsible for that company's workers. So these pensions are in a very poor state indeed, which, and I don't mean to be taking up so much of your time by discussing pensions, but that's the reason that unions really will do anything to try and grow their membership, to try and increase their membership, because they are in big trouble with regards pensions. The only way they can fix this problem is by having young people who are going to come and work for 20 or 30 years, paying into the pension plan, which is required, not optional, and then they don't collect until the very end. They want a stream of people, such as you, paying the pension money, and then that will help fix their problems. But since we saw from the slide before, they are not getting these young people to sign up. Well, since these unions are really desperate, in the United States, they have been changing the rules. They've been doing all they can to change existing rules to get new members. One thing they're doing is what's called ambush elections. They have shrunk the time between when an election is announced and the time of the election from about 47 days to 21 days. That's because they hope that the employer won't be able to say anything against them and put the alternative case to the workers. By the time a union has a petition for representation, they've already lined up what they think is a majority of the workforce. So they've shrunk the time. They've also changed the rules in that they're trying to allow what's called micro-unions. It used to be that all the workers in a company had to vote to join a union. So what the National Labor Relations Board has done is make a rule to say that smaller groups within a company are allowed to vote to join a union. So for example, you can have cosmetics workers at Macy's. Instead of the whole of the Macy's department store voting, they say, well, you can have the cosmetics workers. They can just vote to join a union. So you might have a little union with cosmetics workers. You might have another one with shoe salesmen. So the employer has to negotiate with different kinds of unions. Also, what's just been announced by the Labor Department is something called the Persuader Rule. The Persuader Rule says that if you're a company and you want advice from a lawyer on, say, tax evasion or sexual harassment or zoning or anything you want, you can hire a lawyer. That lawyer's advice is private. No one has to know that you hired a lawyer. But if you want to hire anyone to advise you on union issues, the name of that lawyer has to be made public. All the lawyer's other clients have to be made public. And the amount that the clients pay to that lawyer have to be made public. And what this does is it discourages lawyers from giving advice to businesses about union issues, thereby making it easier for them to make a mistake. It also encourages, it favors large firms, because large firms have their lawyers in-house working for them. A firm such as Teva or such as IBM will have its own legal department within it. It doesn't have to hire any outside lawyers. But a small company that's all of a sudden faced with a demand for union representation, the first thing they will do is hire an outside lawyer. They're also trying to discourage independent contractors because those are less easily organized. So say that you are independent and you're doing some work for the company, the Labor Department's trying to discourage that. They want everybody under the company rule because that way it'll make it easier for if there's any union drive for them to sign up. Finally, what they're trying to do is, and these are all individual rules, is say that someone who works for a franchise is not actually employed by that franchise. So someone who's employed by, say, McDonald's, up to now has been an employee of that little McDonald's restaurant. What they're trying to say is that really that employee is an employee of McDonald's USA, which is the company that gives out the franchises. That way, they think, they'll be able to go to McDonald's USA and say, why don't you sign an agreement with us to be able to unionize all the workers, all the McDonald's workers in all your franchises. And there's been a particular emphasis on what they call fast food, these small franchise restaurants like Burger King, McDonald's, Taco Bell, Wendy's. And you might ask, does anyone here know why they are emphasizing fast food? Does anyone have any idea?
Who emphasizes?
Yeah, the unions. Why are they trying to unionize the fast food stores by ending franchise employers as an entity in themselves? Yes.
Students. The young usually, they're looking for young workers, like you said before.
They have really low
and
wages.
a large amount of workers in all the country.
Right. There are a large amount of workers. Yes.
It's an industry in crisis, so they have incentive to join to protect themselves.
Right. Yeah. Yes. The fast food right now is some kind of crisis. Yes. And the thing about young workers is they have a lot of turnover. So each fast food restaurant, for one position, it might have 3 people. It might have someone working in the summer, and then they go back to university, because summer jobs are very common in the United States. And then maybe they'll hire somebody else for the fall, and then that person will find a better job, and someone else for the spring. So on average, there's 3 people for every positions within a year. Well, unions don't just get the 2 to 4% of the paycheck. They also get an initiation fee. The initiation fee is about $50. So if you have 3 people in a position, that's not $50 a year. That's $150 a year. So they get more revenue from trying to unionize firms with high turnover. That would be more or less a money machine. Well, in Israel, as you know, unions have different rules, and I'm going to, with your assistance, go through a little bit about the unions in Israel. And as we heard yesterday, the main one is the Histadrut, which runs major enterprises, Klalit, Bank Hapolim, Kur, Solet Boni, and has benefited from many kinds of government subsidies, and has a very close relationship, I believe, not just with the Labour Party, but with many other parties also. But also in Israel, just as in the United States, the number of union workers has been declining. So if we look at 1981, as a percent of workers on salary, in 1981, about 80% of workers belonged to unions. And this has gradually declined. And in 2012, the latest data that we could find, it was about 27%. So there's been a gradual decline in Israel, as there has been in the United States. And here's another view of this unionization among all workers. This is as a percent of total workers, not just salaried workers, has seen a commensurate decline. So here is the percent unionized by sector. And I'm not quite sure how many of you can read these letters, but right at the top, and maybe you all can read this to me and translate it, because I got this from this Kohelet report, and they did not have the English. But right at the very top, you can see that there's the electricity workers, who are the most unionized, and they also are, I believe, the highest paid. And maybe some of you can comment on this graph for me, since it's in Hebrew. Can any of you read any of these points on the graph? Why don't you read it and translate it for me?
חשמל ומים is on the top, electricity and water, and then בנקאות, פיתוח ופיננסי, banks, insurance and finance, מנהל ציבורי,
Public government.
yeah. And then you have education scheme, חינוך, education, בריאות רווחה וסעד, it's health and welfare and again welfare. תחבורה ותקשורת, it's transportation and communication, שירותים קהילתיים, חקלאות, agriculture.
Which is the one at the very lowest on the bottom left?
שירותים למשקי הבית.
Household services.
Household services. So that's an area that's very difficult to unionize. It's very difficult to unionize that area. And at the top,
Ports.
Both there will be with
Ports,
They're not here.
public companies.
No, they're not here.
Who is not here?
They're outside of the graph.
They would have a good lobby. They got a good lobby. They came out of the ground.
well, you can see here that just as in the United States, public and private unionization rates have diverged. So the private sector unionization rate, and many of these services that we saw in the previous graph are private sector, and the public sector has stayed the same, or it's just declined slightly. And politically, it's much easier for the public sector to be unionized in the United States, and it's possibly the same in Israel. I don't know if unions here, and maybe you can tell me if they're allowed to provide political contributions, but the way it works in the United States is that the unions give money to the politicians, and the politicians then raise the salaries of the government workers. So it's a circular system. The money just goes round and round, and the amount spent the amount that's spent by the taxpayer keeps on going up, because these unions are giving contributions to the politicians who then stay in place and give them raises. So it's really very insidious. So the model of the union as helping the members, it does work in the private sector, but it also means that the taxpayers are paying huge amounts for these workers. Please do, yes.
We have very strict money in politics laws, but what they do is something else. You have, for example, I think the best example is Tasiya Avirit, is aerial enterprises. It's a huge government-owned company, and what they do is they lobby the two leading parties on who will give them the most, and then all the workers go and sign up for the primaries in this party to support the politicians who, and for the past few elections, the leader of this union is also a leading member of Knesset in Likud.
Right. So it's not so much about helping the workers, it's about getting more political power and getting more political contributions. And what's important is, it's important for this to be transparent. I'm not sure about if it's required for the amounts to be disclosed. Here in the United States, it's required for the amounts to be disclosed. So if you're interested, you can go to a website called opensecrets.org, and then you can look at any union. You can see how much they have given. You can look at any politician. You can see how much they have received from each different union, and by the way, from all private sector individuals. You can put anyone's name in opensecrets.org, including names of unions, and you can see how much they have given to what politician. That's any amount over $250. So if I were to give more than $250 to a politician, my name would be in that database, going back years and years. It doesn't just disappear. Question over here, yes.
It's not a question, it's a comment.
Please.
In Israel, we can know what the unions do with their money, because they work under an Ottoman law, that they can do whatever they want. We don't know how much money, what they're doing with it.
It's only good.
What you mean, Ottoman?
Yes, literally, Pedro literally Ottoman.
לא, זה לא חוק העבודות, זה חוק העבודות העות'מאניות, הם תחתיו, and אין שקיפות.
אבל זה לא רק ההסתדרות.
לא, כל האיגודים.
אמיר פייגלר אתמול אמר שזה רק ההסתדרות.
לא, כל האיגודים.
Can someone explain to me why the Ottoman law was not changed with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948?
We asked ourselves the same question.
So there's also British laws that still apply.
A lot of British law.
Unless someone changed them.
But why is it, I suppose it's so hard to change the laws because the unions object to the change.
Because
They won't allow them to be changed.
there was a few tries in the Knesset, but all the time it's not best to be.
Right.
Even the budget is not that transparent. So.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Well, we heard something yesterday about the cost and the slowdowns. And here's the total number of Israeli work slowdowns by year, and the number of participants in the work slowdowns. And well, a slowdown means that they don't go on strike, but they just work more slowly. They do things such to make an obstacle. For example, in the United States a couple of years ago, and about every 5 or 6 years, there's a ports slowdown as they're trying to renegotiate their contract. They don't go on strike, but they actually slow down to make it more difficult for the employers.
In Japan, they have a work in. When they strike, they work more hours.
Well, here's the annual number of Israeli strikes and lockouts. Now it's about 26 a year, with 38,000 workers participating, and in 2002 it was 1.6 million workers taking part. So you can see that things have improved, and things have improved with the decline in union participation.
What is the lockout?
What is what?
The lockout.
Well, here's the number of days. Lockout. Lockout is where the employer says, we're not going to let you in. Not just a strike. And that's when the employer says, just go away because, and we're not going to pay you because we don't have a contract. A strike is when the worker says he's not going to work. A lockout is when the employer says, we're not going to hire you.
Does it happen in Israel?
According to the data, it does. There are data on it that says.
Anybody can think?
Yeah, the lower has
It happened with, I think, with Agerstein and maybe a couple of other places.
Oh, really?
And in the end, they unionized Agerstein.
So here's another graph, the number of work days lost, again from strikes and lockouts, and it has decreased in current times. Here's lost days of work, public and private sector, and I believe that you saw this yesterday in Amir's presentation. And these are, by the way, very interesting data assembled in this, and I would highly recommend, if any of you are interested, this is available online also. So this is the lost days of work. You can see the more highly unionized sector, the public sector, has more lost days of work than the private sector. Now,
Who pays for the wages of the strikers? They are paid a wage by the union, or they simply do without any
by the
income?
employer.
They have like a
Fun.
a fund.
They have a fund. They have a fund. They
Yeah.
collect money and then they support part. Depends how much
Most of
it
the time
is.
they're public companies, so eventually they pay on tax money.
No, I'm pretty sure that if the strike is legal, they're paid by the employer.
Oh, strike?
No.
No.
I worked in a bank. I was part of a union in Stabus, and we didn't get money. They have, depends on what companies, but most part of the companies have like a fund that they put money aside for the union and then they get it. But most of the companies don't get money.
In the United States, they also have strike funds. They take part of union dues and they put them in strike funds to give them the money to have the strike and pay the members while the strike's going on.
So two weeks ago, I was hearing the head of Koach L'Ovdim, which is one of the, it's smaller than the institute, it's growing fast. He was talking about the amount of money that unions have in Ireland, and for example, the institute in Israel has almost nothing compared to those.
Nothing.
Those funds don't really have a lot of money.
Can you repeat it?
You are saying that the person ahead of the Koach L'Ovdim, I forgot his name. He said he was like giving examples from Ireland.
You can speak a little bit louder. Speak louder so everyone can hear.
So basically, the power that those unions have, it depends a lot on the amount of money that they have in those funds. So the person ahead of Koach L'Ovdim was saying about, like, he was talking about the amount of money that the funds on Ireland, for example, like billions. He was saying $20-30 billion that they have in those funds, and that in Israel they have $30-40 million, something like that.
Now this is a graph of lost production from strikes. And if I could have someone translate what it says, that would be very helpful. Why doesn't one of you come and tell me what this graph is showing?
It's lost.
As a result of strikes.
Yeah, lost production as a result of strikes in millions of shekels.
Yeah. And what is the light blue line and what are the dark blue bars?
It's averages over the years.
Yeah. So we can see that the average has actually gone down and that things in that way are improving. But it could also be that the government is just giving in to the large public sector unions. And thereby there are fewer lost days' work, which is also not ideal. So the question is what to do about this, and there are a number of solutions that could be applied to Israel. One thing is to allow workers to opt out of unions. And in the United States, we have states that are what's called right to choose, and states that are what we call forced unionization. And over the past 3 or 4 years, the number of right-to-work states has grown. Now it's 26. It's going to be 27 soon. Kentucky is going to join. And as there are more and more right-to-work states, there's more pressure on the others to become right-to-work. So in a right-to-work state, you can't be forced to join a union. Even if there is a union, you're allowed to opt out, and you don't have to pay dues to the union. And a lot of people like this because it means that you're not forced to join and you're not forced to have the amount taken out of your paycheck. I think another thing to do is prevent public sector unions from striking. In the United States, some workers are not allowed to go on strike. Back in the early 1980s, in 1981, the air traffic controllers went on strike, and President Reagan fired them. That was one of the first things he did, was fire the air traffic controllers. They went on strike illegally, but they never thought that they would be fired. But he did. In fact, President Reagan was probably our highest serving union official who was president. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild. But he demonstrated his strength by firing this group of people, and that group has never been the same again, the Air Traffic Controllers Union. He just hired a whole lot of new people back. So public sector workers are not supposed to go on strike. Railways and airlines, there's something called the Railway Labor Act that doesn't allow the railways to go on strike and the airlines to go on strike. And some of us are trying to add ports to this because having a port strike is extremely disruptive. Federal government workers have to sign an oath that they are not allowed to go on strike. Yes?
So another problem we have is there is a court that's in charge to decide whether the strikes are legal or not legal, and is not really objective. So whatever, like most of the cases, we go to the court, and so the result is not, it's the same result all the time. So there is not an objective body that's in charge to decide whether it's legal or not.
So it sounds like the law needs to be clarified if it takes that much time. So as well as preventing public sector unions, I would advise preventing important private sector unions from striking, which goes to the issue of the ports and the railroads and labor. A fourth point is require a majority of workers to vote for the union before allowing a company to be unionized. I understand that under the Ottoman laws, it's just 33% vote for a union before a company is unionized. And I suggest that be raised to over 50% to allow to have a majority vote for a firm. I would also recommend having annual elections as to whether the firm, the workers want to stay in the union. In other words, require unions to be recertified annually. So if 1 year members decide they don't want to vote for a union, then the union is decertified, as it's called. This is, by the way, not true in the United States. All these laws that the Labor Department has put in, for example, having 3 weeks to the union election, that doesn't hold for a decertification election. You can have 3 weeks to be elected to a union, but workers are not allowed to call an election and within 3 weeks vote to get out of the union. The Labor Department is trying to push workers into the union, not enable them to get out. And frequently in the United States, you have to have a period of 2 or 3 years before a decertification election is allowed to take place. And it's so hard to get decertified that you often find that only about 5 or 10% of the workers in a union, in a company, have voted to join that union. Because if workers vote to join a union and then they quit, and new workers are hired, then they are in the union without having voted to join it or not. And I think we need to keep in mind that these unions are supposed to represent workers. They're not supposed to be organizations to A, influence politics, or B, make big political contributions, or 3, change national policy. And if workers aren't voting to join them, then they shouldn't be there, and these votes should be more frequent. Another suggestion I have is not allow the employers to deduct dues from the workers' paychecks. The employer does not deduct electricity payments. It doesn't deduct worker payments. It shouldn't be deducting the union dues. If the union wants to collect the money, it should go and have to collect the money from individuals separately. In fact, Governor Walker of Wisconsin, who was at one point a presidential candidate, made this step in Wisconsin. He said, you can join a union, but I, as the government of Wisconsin, is not going to deduct the dues. You're free to join if you want. Well, what happened is about half of them quit. So, so actually having the government or the employer take the money right out of the paycheck is very beneficial to the union, but it's not clear that it's in the interest of the worker.
I'd say one comment on that. The history of the unions in Israel is that it used to offer a lot of other services like healthcare before there was public healthcare, and because of that people joined freely and they took care of to pass the money because they wanted their healthcare. But once there was public healthcare, then there was mass leaving of the unions. And the reasons that they decided to collect the dues from the employers, if they wouldn't do that, it probably dropped down almost to zero, the percentage of unionized people. So
yes. Well, I mean, it used to be that unions were able to, and I admire them for this, fighting for basic safety in the workplace, for example. But now we have government entities that require safety in the workplace. So it's like with these feminist lobbies. The feminists fought for equality of opportunity, and they won. But they're not going to say, thanks, we won, and then go away, because then they'd be out of a job. They wouldn't have a job anymore. And it's just like that with these unions. They fought for certain workplace conditions. In fact, in the United States, there's a bumper sticker that said, unions, the ones who brought you the 5-day work week. Well, Israel still doesn't have the 5-day work week, but unions credit themselves in the United States for bringing the 5-day work week. But now that they've brought it, they're not just going to say, thank you, we're not needed anymore, we'll go away. No, they stick around. So many of the functions, they've been successful, but they're still there fighting for more. Question, yes.
Actually, why do you think they were successful? And like, what was the role of the union, or what was beneficial in the union originally, and why that has changed like 100% and now basically they don't bring anything good and new and just actually hurting the economy? And like, what should we do from one side?
Well, for example, it was pointed out.
Add something to this?
Please.
It's productivity that gives you the 5-day week.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's productivity, it's not the union. But as you pointed out, they used to say provide certain professional services that are now available elsewhere. And it's very possible that some of the safety measures they required to be put in place, such as in mines, for example, which are a very dangerous place to work, I would say that those were beneficial. The training that they are providing the training the shipping union is providing is now very helpful to the maritime union. There's also a union of culinary workers in Nevada. And when companies are laid off from, say, fast food restaurants, they provide training to these waiters to enable them to work in higher level restaurants. So I think that some of these functions are extremely useful, but others of them aren't. Which brings me to my next point, that unions should be required to report all revenues and expenditures. This was put in place in the Labor Department when I was working there, and funnily enough, it was a very big battle. It used to be that unions would submit their forms, what was called an LM2 form, and it could have 1 million dash other, or 2 million expenses. And Secretary Chow made them break that down, so any expenditure over $250 has to be reported. And that's important because it's the union, it's not the money of the unions, it's the money of the members. Members deserve to know where their money is going. And if union officials are, say, going to the beach in Eilat on the money and having fancy meetings in fancy hotels, then union members should be able to know about that. Also, it places some check on what these union officials can actually do. If they know that every golf trip has to be reported, they're going to take fewer golf trips, for example. They're also required to divide it into lobbying and campaigning and politics and representation and bargaining, so members can actually see how much has been spent on bargaining. Require reporting of conflicts of interest. Now, that was something we tried to do in the Bush administration, and we didn't quite get it through before the clock struck and President Bush was out of office. We almost got it through. In other words, we got it through, but then it was rolled back. Because if you get through a rule too late in the term and then the next president takes over, the president can roll back some of the rules that you passed. That was rolled back. So what that rule did was, if a union official, for example, got a loan or gave a loan to someone who was a relative, that had to be reported. It had to be any transaction, or if they bought a whole set of T-shirts, you saw some T-shirts in the other picture, from someone who was a relative, that had to be reported. They had to report any transactions between people with whom they had a relationship. But that unfortunately got rolled back. And my last suggestion is that all this information be published online so that anybody can see it. Just like these LM2 forms in the United States, you can put it into Google, you can get the original form. What it also means is that there's other companies that can use this information. So in the United States, there's something called unionfacts.com, which gets the material off the LM2 forms and presents it in a very easy form. Unionfacts.com, you just put in the name of your union. You can just check it right there to see how much they've spent. So if there's a union election coming up, you can actually check and see what's going on. This makes all this a lot more transparent. Pardon? So the Labor Department, the union is required to file a form every year with the Labor Department. The Labor Department is required to put that online electronically. Before Secretary Chow, they were just filled out in paper and they were put in a filing cabinet. They weren't put online. Then other companies, just private companies, come and say, well, we're going to take this information and we are going to make our own website with it, which is, of course, completely legal. You can make your own website, and there's no charge for going to that website. Like, for example, opensecrets.org. That gets the material from the Federal Election Commission website. And sometimes these government websites are a little bit hard to access. They don't present the material in a very easy way. But then there can be other groups that come and do that. Then people like Mark Perry can put it on his blog and say, look how much the SEIU gave to, you know, Donald Trump or whoever it is, whatever the candidate is. It wouldn't be Donald Trump. It would probably be Hillary Clinton. Yes.
Can you expand a little more about preventing strikes, especially in what way it should be done?
Well, there can be laws saying, for example, in the United States, there's a law that says federal government workers are not allowed to go on strike. They have to take, and I actually have the actual bit of the US Code, they have to take an oath. They have to swear when they sign their papers of employment that they will not go on strike. So it's completely prevented in the public sector. In the private sector, there are certain companies that fall under the Railway Labor Act. This is a different provision of the law. There's the National Labor Relations Act, where workers are allowed to strike, and the Railway Labor Act, where striking is more difficult. It is still allowed, but there are presidential emergency boards that kick in, and there's mandatory arbitration. This holds for, first of all, the railways. It was put in place for the railways. Then airlines were added, and now some of us are trying to get ports added to it. So this is a different law that makes it more difficult to strike and has what's called mandatory arbitration. Yes?
I want to be a bit of the devil's advocate. There's a very famous graph out of middle class wages and union decline. That shows that basically it's opposites. Unions, middle class wages go down. The unionization also goes down, and that's one of the strongest arguments of unions is that they protect the workers from the employers that they make their wages higher.
Yeah. So there was actually in January a report by the Center for American Progress, which is one of the most left-wing think tanks in Washington, that made this very point, that the middle class is hollowing out. It's hollowing out because there's less union representation. And because of this, we need more union membership in order to raise the wages of the middle class. And this is flawed on so many grounds. First of all, the middle class is only hollowing out because people from the middle class are getting richer. And this can be documented. It's been extensively documented, and I can share the articles with you. And Mark Perry, in fact, has been writing something about that on his blog. He also has that information. And we want the middle class to get richer. There are also demographic reasons why there are more people in the lowest income quintiles. There are more singles, for example. There are older people living longer who are living not off income but off assets. So there's many reasons for the disappearance of the middle class. There's more women in the workforce, which means there are more two-earner couples. And anytime there's two singles in the middle class or in, say, the second quintile, they get married, they almost immediately go to one of the upper classes. So the fact that there are so many more two-earner couples that work, means that people in the middle class have moved up. The second thing that's wrong with it is that unions would actually raise wages. As you saw from the graph, many union workers are older. So since they're older, they earn more money, because you earn more money when you're in your 50s than when you're in your 20s. So that's one reason it appears that union workers earn more. But if you put workers in their 20s and you immediately assign them to a union, their wages aren't going to go up, because the predominant characteristics of union workers is they are older. Also, they're in certain manufacturing sectors and certain government sectors. You have them, for example, in public sector government, which has higher wages. If you take someone in fast food and you have that individual join a union, or someone who works for a hotel as a cleaner and joins a union, they're not going to get the salary of someone who works as a manager in the Wisconsin state government, for example. So there's a lot of confusion about this, but you're absolutely right. It's a great question. In fact, we wrote something on this on Economics 21 on this very point, because my boss called me from New York and said, Diana, there's this myth going around about unions helping the middle class. Can you write something about it? And I can give all of you, it's on economics21.org, or I can send you the link if any of you are interested. Yes. And then after you. Yeah. No, go ahead.
I'm trying to think about like what would be a perfectly functioning union. And the way I see it is that in times of very good profitability, the workers get higher wages, and it's harder because you do collective bargaining. But in times of low profitability, it's very hard to renegotiate lower salaries one by one, and the union can help you like put all the wages down. So that's a perfectly functioning, I think, a very good functioning union. The question is there evidence that some unions work this way? Is this something that we ever see?
I think there's also another question is, would that happen normally? Generally, in times of high profitability, workers might get bonuses on their own without even having the unions. And one characteristic of unions is that merit bonuses. At least in the United States, merit bonuses are forbidden. Everybody has to get the same salary. But I would say the main functions of the union, I think training is an important function, perhaps providing health insurance if they can't get it other ways. A union should be a professional association. Bargaining, it's very difficult to have bargaining without having employment consequences, adverse employment consequences. So you might say the United Auto Workers maybe did a good job for its members by bargaining for a $73 an hour compensation package. So they came back, everybody was very happy, they got the $73 an hour, and then Ford and GM said, oh, we're going to China and Mexico. So with capital and labor and manufacturing, capital and manufacturing, very mobile in a global economy, and labor is less mobile, it's very difficult to keep the industries there if you don't provide a good package that's amenable both to the employer and the worker. I would say the Maritime Workers Union is probably the ideal functioning one, in my view. Yes, question over here.
I have a quite similar question. I believe that these days labor unions are a symbol of, part of them are a symbol of corruption and nepotism. And my question is if it's always was like that, or it's a new phenomenon in the last decade.
I think that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think employers used to have more power, and where there was less information. So it was easier for employers, so to speak, to hide things from the workforce, to pull the wool over their eyes. So the original persuader rule that I talked about earlier, that was because some employer had someone come and talk to their workforce who was really employed by the employer and pretended to be employed by the union. So there was what's called an asymmetry of information. So I think it's possible that in those days, some unions performed more of an information gathering function. It was harder for people to actually move locations, physical locations. People would buy furniture. That was an expenditure for life. It was a lifetime purchase, buying furniture. And you wouldn't think so much of moving. But now, everybody, if they move just like that, if they can find a better job. And what unions primarily do now is seem to keep down the number of jobs and force companies to go offshore and overseas. And it's just interesting the low percent that are in the private sector compared with the high percent in the public sector. No one can say that these government workers need union protection from bargaining. They have higher than average salaries. They have more vacations. They never get fired because the government never fires anybody, even if they didn't belong to the union. So it's not clear what value added the unions in these public sector unions are giving to the workers. They're just acting as a conduit for political contributions in campaigns. And it's interesting that you have unions complain about private sector donors. You have them complain about people like Warren Buffett or the Charles and David Koch. You never hear them complaining about the unions, even though they give more than many of these wealthy individuals. Yes?
If I can say a comment about that, in Israel, I think the unions has a big part in legislation because the Israeli law allows them, if they make an agreement between them and between employers union, the Minister of Economy can elaborate this rule on the whole market, and it doesn't have to go into a Congress vote. So and there are quite a few rules like transportation fees and the pensions we have. It's all because of the unions. There's no law for that. It's just an agreement that they did, and the Minister of Economy just by one order made it elaborate in the whole market. So they have a big part in quick legislation for the workers. So it's an added value, I think.
Right. Well, I think that you also have to look at how this also affects the cash wage, because if you have more of these other kinds of required things, such as pensions, then you have a lower cash wage and you have less spending power. But in Israel also you see that the private sector is much better functioning, and again, it has many fewer unions. Question?
There's an assumption that a major change in labor laws is possible only when you have an economic crisis. Would you agree with this assumption, or what can we do when we don't have an economic crisis?
There was a famous politician in the United States, actually it was the person who is now mayor of Chicago, called Rahm Emanuel, who said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." And what he did was, right when President Obama took office, they had a very large increase in the budget, a very large increase in welfare. They made changes that were supposed to be temporary, but in fact have since been made permanent. So he succeeded in using this crisis to raise the level of welfare. But I wouldn't say that that was a positive change. The more positive changes come from regulatory reform and tax reform, and these were not performed during a crisis. For example, in 1986, when there was the Tax Reform Act of 1986, that brought down the top tax rate from 50% down to 28%. That was not a time of crisis. 2001, when President George W. Bush did his tax reform, that was not a time of crisis. So the legislation that's passed in the time of crisis, such as, for example, the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act, I think, and Sarbanes-Oxley Financial Reform Act, I think those have gone overboard, and you generally do not get good legislation in times of crisis. The better legislation is something that's been thought out in advance. At least in the United States, our Congress is not very good at thinking out these laws in advance, but occasionally it does happen.
Yes. So this is like Hannah, and I don't want to be an evil advocate.
Oh, absolutely. You can ask any question you like, Corinne.
But I think they should think about that. I mean, one of the arguments in favor of union is asymmetric information between the employer and the employee. And also when it comes to government and to lobbying for regulation, obviously the employer has much more power than the cleaner or the waiter at McDonald's. So the union could be, and I'm not talking about the corruption, and I'm not talking about the golf trip and so on, which is a different issue. But the union is basically an organization of workers that is trying to a little bit equilibrate the information between the employer and the employee. May not be a bad thing. Or is it, I mean, what's your opinion on it?
Well, these days there's a lot of information available, and there's also a lot of mobility. Back in the early days of the union movement, I think there was more asymmetry of information because we didn't have the internet. People couldn't find out alternatives in terms of employment. There was not a government that would regulate safety in the workplace. You could use whatever chemicals you wanted. In mines, you could take shortcuts. You weren't prosecuted, or there wasn't the shame factor if there was an accident. Workers' lives were very cheap. Everyone's lives were very cheap. If you think of how many people were killed in the First World War or the Second World War, people would never stand for that right now. So a few dead workers didn't matter very much in terms of a front page headline in a newspaper. It was just taken for granted. So I think there was more of an asymmetry of information then, and unions were perhaps more needed then. But now I don't think that this function is so important. Question?
If the head of the union in the United States, he can do his regular job, he must do, or he can be just the head of the union?
He's just head of the union, and he doesn't do a job. Interestingly enough, in the United States government, in the federal workforce, there's a concept known as, quote, official time, unquote. And as with many of these things, they are misnamed. official time is the amount that unionized government workers are allowed to spend working completely for their union and not at all working for the taxpayer. So with the air traffic controllers, for example, there are 19 air traffic controllers who are paid government salaries, but they spend all their time working for the union, even though they are paid by the government. The union officials that you're talking about, those are paid by the union. So the union has funds. And you can look at unionfacts.com and you can get the salaries of the top 10 people who work for the union. And it's many, many multiples of the amount. It's often they make about $250,000 a year. I mean, it's a very, very well-paid job. And one of the things that I enjoy putting in columns is how they complain about the wage, and then they are being paid so much. They complain about CEO salaries and multiples of CEO salaries, and yet they are being paid many multiples of what the workers they represent are being paid, and their pensions are better funded. But these federal government workers are being paid by the government, not by the union. And these air traffic controllers, 17 out of the 18 make over $100,000 a year, and 5 of them make $179,000 a year. Some of us did a Freedom of Information Act request to find that information. And there are other people like that too. There is no reason that someone who works for the federal government should not do any work for the taxpayer, because there isn't very much bargaining with the federal government. They can't bargain for wages anyway. So again, it's just a matter of union political power. Any more questions about this or any other economic matters or labor matters? Okay, well, I think we finished the questions. Well, thank you very much.